Right, good evening and welcome to Upfront on the Joy News channel. Now, in Ghana's quest to get that $3 billion bailout package from the IMF, there was one thing we had to do. It was a big condition. That is to restructure our debt, which was assessed as unsustainable. At the domestic level and at the external level, we had to do this. For the domestic level, it's a bingo. We've been able to do it with participation rate of about 85%. But the external debt, if you have followed the news, you realize that China seemed to be more or less like the missing piece in this whole collective negotiation. You may have also seen the story on China having access to Ghana's mineral revenues, including power sales, as a result of some 4 loans that we took in 2007 and 2018. And, we want to discuss this on Upfront. And joining me for this conversation is Professor Godfred Bokpin. He is a professor of finance at the University of Ghana Business School. And also Dr. Ismail, Jansen Hlovo. He's an international development expert. My guest will be joining me via Zoom. Please stay with me after this break. Welcome back to Upfront on the Joy News channel. Tonight, a very big conversation on Ghana's external debt restructuring. We asked a very simple question. Why is China so important? Joining me for this conversation, there's Professor Godfred Bokpin. He's an economist and a professor of finance at the University of Ghana Business School. Dr. Ismail Jansen Hlovo is also an international development expert. Gentlemen, you're welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good evening.
Right. Good evening, Doc.
Good evening, my co-panelists, and good evening to our cherished viewers.
Yeah. Good evening, bro.
Good evening, boss.
Right. So let me start on this note. We will have the China conversation, but Professor Bokpin, I'm sure you've seen news going around, and also you've heard the President Kofi Agyei saying that he's hinting government's intention to go back to the Eurobond market very soon. Do you think soon is relative anyway, but do you think it's too early to be thinking about going back to the international fund market?
Well, I think from government perspective, it's always been on the table that left to them alone, they would have returned to the market like yesterday, right? Because borrowing from the international capital market at some point in time in Africa looks like the most competitive league. How often you are able to go there, assess the capital, billions of dollars, and it used to be, we have had a kinky party over that in this country, not only in Ghana and all of that. But I think that clearly, once the market kicked us out, and I'm sure it's interesting that it's the president who is talking about this also, because government posture has been that they have not been reckless with borrowing. But actually, that was the verdict that the market delivered in the 3rd quarter of 2021. Okay, Ghana practically lost access to the international capital market from the 3rd quarter of 2021. Okay, and therefore, and with the several downgrades, it may take a little while because remember that our external commercial, in terms of Eurobonds, we are now going to more or less scale up the conversation in terms of the debt restructuring. Usually, it takes a little while to complete that. So whilst that is hanging, it may be a bit complex to go back to the international capital market that you want to issue Eurobonds or whatever. And therefore, but I think what we need to focus on now is how do we build our credibility and scale up on the rating scale, right? From both Fitch, Standard & Poor's, and then Moody's. That is very important. And then also, if you look at the way the IMF program is designed and the financing arrangement, it relies heavily on domestic revenue mobilization, okay? And therefore, we need to focus on that. But going forward, my considered view is that as a country, we cannot do without borrowing. either from the domestic market or from the international capital market. What we need to do as part of the IMF program is how do we strengthen the fiscal regime? How do we strengthen the public financial management, especially post-loan acquisition monitoring mechanisms? If you look at the current Public Financial Management Act, the process to acquire loan is clearly ironed out, drawing inspiration from the Constitution and then through the PFM, the Minister of Finance, the role of Parliament and all of that. But you will see that once the loan arrives, once the money arrives and we throw the kinky party, and sometimes for balanced diet, we add wachi to it, right? then everything is left to the politicians to do and manage the money as they deem fit, okay? And therefore, sometimes, and then you see because of the rigidities, just roughly around 30% or so of the borrowed funds have essentially gone into infrastructure, okay? And then we have also not been able to ensure value for money in how these borrowed funds are invested. Because if you look at it across the world, you will see that some countries have even higher debt to GDP ratio compared to Ghana. Okay? But the point is that if Ghana had invested the borrowed funds efficiently in enhancing the cash flow generation capacity of this economy, the conversation, the content of the conversation would have been different.
Well, Prof,
okay.
let me come in here. You know, we've seen the IMF program, and for 2023, for instance, the financing gap in terms of balance of payment is estimated at close to $4.5 billion. IMF is offering 1.2 billion. I think World Bank is also giving out 530 or 550 million Ghana dollars. If you add this to, we've crossed over 2 billion cedis. We still have a deficit of more than 2.5 billion dollars to cover. Is it the case that the IMF program is not sufficient in terms of balance of payment support, especially for 2023 and for subsequent years?
The IMF has been very clear in terms of the fact that we would need more resources than the IMF itself could provide. And that is why, smartly, the IMF made financing assurance a prior action before the program could be approved. Because with that funding gap, if they had gone ahead to approve the program can only achieve limited effectiveness, okay? Because the record, and then if you look at the program, you see that throughout the program duration, the financing arrangements, right, in terms of balance of payment support overall, is estimated to be around $15 billion, right? And the IMF is only providing just about 20% of that. And that is why the financing assurance was critical. And even though Ghana had met some of the critical other prior actions, the staff level agreement couldn't go to the board for approval because one important prior action was missing, which was the financing assurance. Now, the way it is structured is such that, and the program itself recognizes the risk from that financing assurance. For now, the details of the financing assurance is yet to be worked out, okay, from the official creditor committee based on the G20 framework.
Well, I think so far we've heard from China. Only G20 common framework. We've not heard from the Eurobond creditors. Is that right?
Yes. So that is a different arrangement that we'll have to. Probably we may get some relief from that. Remember that already, based on the G20 framework, government has taken advantage of the debt service suspension clause. Okay, and therefore, for the whole of this year, we are not making any coupon payment on Eurobonds. Okay, so that level of FX, foreign exchange, has been preserved, and that also helped Bank of Ghana in their liquidity management. Okay, so the idea is that if we are able to resolve that, and then we end up with, let's say, MPV negative, meaning that the Eurobond holders will take some haircuts.
Yeah.
Okay. And that haircut will be gained for us. That will be the relief from us. But more importantly, from the G20 framework, from the official creditor committee, co-chaired by France and China, what it is expected is they either give us debt relief or fresh funding. Okay, so that would also show up in terms of FX inflows to our economy. And part of that also will be directed to budgetary funding.
the G20 common framework. I'll come back to, Dr. Hlovo, but the G20 common framework was actually for poor countries, lower income countries. We are a middle income country. How did we qualify for this program? And in fact, if you look at Zambia, they were the first to apply for this facility. So I like to say that if you look at our IMF, mates, Zambia is number 1, Chad is number 2, there's Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. They all went before us. I'm sure we are different from them in terms of the, the brackets when it comes to lower or middle income country. How did we qualify for this framework, and how did you get it so fast?
Yes, I think that the West, the Bretton Woods institutions saw this coming long ago. And it's similar to what happened in the case of HIPC. Okay, towards the end of 2000, they saw the way developing countries were ramping up debt on their books and the challenges, and therefore they designed a treatment, also aided significantly by the Jubilee campaign, now called the Debt Justice Foundation or so, right? So they designed a treatment which they called HIPC, okay, and the countries that qualified. So under this framework, because HIPC is no longer available, they needed to design another framework to resolve the debt buildup on the books of these low-income developing countries, and that captures Ghana as well. Right? And the countries have to make that application in all of this. So I think on one breath, yes, but remember that debt relief, some may come in terms of the reprofiling, okay? But where Ghana finds is, and that's why we had said that the level of economic crisis, financial crisis, both at the macro level and the micro level, is such that IMF funding alone is not enough. And if you look at the way the IMF has designed the program, they are actually outsourcing some limitations to factors even beyond their control. Beyond their control. Because, and I'm sure they would have learned a useful lesson from the case of Zambia, where they hurriedly approved the program after the initial release. Subsequently, the official creditor committee and its work slowed, also because of the role of China and how China feels it's being treated within the G20.
Now, on the part of China, let me bring in Dr. Ishmael Hlovo on this. Doc, President Akufo-Addo is giving hints that we may go back to the international capital market soon. Do you think that is very early to start entertaining some of these loan arrangements, especially at the bilateral level?
Okay, good evening to you and good evening to your viewers. For government, they will always need money. And of course, loans are part of what they can get to run the economy. So they can't do without money, as Prof has indicated. There's no nation in this world that can do without some form of borrowing. So yes, we will continue to borrow, but it depends on how you use your money. Now, at this point, far away, he may be talking about going back to the international capital market. But at the bilateral level, we are now having the task of engaging some of these people that we are owing, including China, who is co-chairing the G20 framework. So as we begin the negotiation, we are supposed to have hopes of where we want to be. And he's right in trying to whip up that positive attitude. Of course, markets sometimes react to positive news. So if you don't communicate those positive news, it may not be so good. So he may try to communicate those positive news, believing that when we engage our lenders, they will treat us favorably. But yes, I think that we just started the journey. We need to now go, because what the IMF is putting on board will not be enough to address all that we need to do. So we need the bilateral creditors to still support us somehow. So it depends on how our negotiations with all these creditors will go, particularly with China and emerging powers. Of course, the Western countries are more friendly. If you look at all the negotiation, you observe that even the IMF became a spokesperson for Ghana.
Yeah.
So we may be likely to get more of a favorable treatment from the Western partners. Well, the Chinese have come on board. If you look at the trend from Sri Lanka to Ghana, they engaged Sri Lanka in March and gave financial assurances. They are coming to terms with the need to help developing countries to restructure their debt. So it depends on what we put on the board, how we negotiate it to get some debt relief. Either they are going to cancel some, take some haircut, and then maybe provide us with some additional funding, because we need additional funding to go through this process to be able to build the economy back and be able to honor the debt that we are currently owing. That's very important.
Now, Doc, there are concerns that China is very opaque in terms of their arrangement, loan arrangement with some countries. We've seen what happened in Zimbabwe and then also in Uganda, where they use part of their assets as collateral against some of the loans they took from China. It is shocking to know that in the IMF program document, we've been able to discover that if you look at Ghana's collateralized loans, it's around $619 million, and the entire sum is owed to China. And we know what they've done to some countries, not to make China feel bad, but we know what happened in Zimbabwe and then what happened in Uganda. Do you see any complication? Although some will say that this loan facilities probably will be under some safety net.
Okay, if we look at the collateralized loans that Ghana has contracted with China, you will realize that they are tied to specific projects. So if you look at the bauxite deal, for instance, it's tied to the exploration of the bauxite. So it then means that once you have mortgaged the bauxite to take that loan, any revenue from the bauxite is expected to service the loan. So if we keep to the agreement, we should be able to honor what we collateralize. We must also be at least clear with ourselves that we enter this agreement knowing very well the implications it has for us.
Absolutely.
So you cannot eat your cake and have it. But I believe that in the negotiations that will proceed, the Chinese will just not seize your assets because you default. In any case, you have entered formal negotiations with them. Yes, it's a little bit complicated because while the Chinese lending is coordinated by the central government, it is handled by multiple financial institutions, various banks and various institutions. And normally these banks and institutions are very difficult in terms of agreeing to take cuts on their investment because it's an investment that they have made. But I believe that once we engage them, you will find a reasonable conclusion to some of these issues so that you will still maintain your asset and be able to pay them off. In any case, it's the same cocoa that you export to pay them. So if they take control of the cocoa export, it's just like taking the money from source. But I do believe that we should be able to negotiate with the Chinese in a manner that will not entail them coming to take over. In any case, the deal that we have entered with the IMF potentially should unlock other revenue sources for the state to be able to resume paying the external creditors. And that also means that we should try to provide more education to Ghanaians to try and use the RMB, because you see, China has become a lender of last resort for many countries. If assuming it is not because we are a highly dollarized society where virtually everybody, even going to China, $1, China have a way of rescuing countries even outside the IMF framework who are in debt crisis. So, for instance, some countries have benefited from currency swap, even up to 3 years. So they were able to go through crisis and repay their debt without necessarily handing over their assets. So we must pursue the idea of making people to understand that you can also trade in the RMB so that we reduce the influence of the dollar in the economy. That is an alternative to the dollarization. Then in case you run into trouble with China, it is easier for them to help you because credit swaps normally are used by more developed nations, US and the European partners, where they assist each other when they are in crisis. Now, but the Chinese are able to use the same method to assist developing countries that are in crisis. So instead of 1 year, sometimes they extend it to even 3 years, which allow those countries to import and do whatever they want to do.
So, Doc, for instance, sorry to interject. For instance, in the case of Dr. Congo or DRC, we know that they went to China and then they were looking for a total write-down of a loan amount of $1.3 billion US. The Chinese were very clear that, we can't give you total, drawdown. What we can do for you is either we extend the maturity period or you pay more in terms of the interest rate. Is that the case for Ghana?
Yes, those may be the potential cases that they may present to us. Of course, this is a market situation, so they would not like to take certain losses. As I said, the Chinese lending is handled by multiple institutions, although the central government coordinates it. But you have the Export Bank of China and other institutions there that are lending. And these are business entities. Now, certain cuts that they will take will affect their profitability and their financial viability. So when it comes to that, most of the times what China does is to extend the period for these commercial loans. So we must look at the option of extension. But then the complication is, will you do the same for other creditor nations? But I believe that we still have enough ability to put all these pieces together and negotiate it well. The Chinese will not want African economies to be collapsing and being attributed to them. So yes, the global geopolitical scene may also play a role in how they view this situation.
Well, I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you on the geopolitics aspect. But Professor Bokwin, $619 million US. Is this the reason why China was more or less the big boy at the negotiation table?
Right. I think this automatically draws in the global geopolitics, right? Unlike the case of Zambia and other African countries, because in those countries, if you look at their external debt, the proportion of that to China is very huge. Okay. But if you look at the case of Ghana, our total external bilateral is less than $6 billion. Okay, around 5.4 or 5.8 billion dollars. Out of that, what we owe to China is $1.9 billion. In the normal scheme of things, China shouldn't have been a big issue in the case of Ghana. Typically, okay, but the reason the China discussion is elevated is because of the global geopolitics. Let's understand it within this context, that there is a new scramble for Africa. The West feels that Africa and a number of African countries have gone excessively the way of China through trade and debt diplomacy. And you get a sense that the West wants their former girlfriend back.
Yeah.
They want Africa back in their fold.
Which includes Ghana.
And that is why the West was insisting that any debt relief under G20 framework binds China to be on the table. China must be on the table at all costs. Now, what is the posture of the West? The posture of the West is that China should offer debt relief. In the case of Zambia and Congo and the rest of them, you know why the West would insist more on that? because the word bond and bondage are from the same family word. So the fact that we owe China makes a certain allegiance to China, okay? And therefore, there's this, within this global geopolitics, geoeconomic fragmentation, new blocks, and building countries along those blocks. If they are able to push China to the level where they grant debt relief, we have gained independence from China. We can now decide to go the way of the West. Remember that in the midst of all these discussions, there are other African countries that have gone the way of China, Russia.
Yeah. So we can talk about South Africa, right?
Yes. Okay. And even Burkina Faso, Mali, Ethiopia. If you look at their foreign policy and all of that now, so you see that in the new Scrabble for Africa and within the context of climate, environmentally friendly growth, resilient, inclusive growth, the resource wealth that is needed in the new transition, Africa has it. Whether you talk about lithium, you talk about this, or you talk about that. Remember, these were the same things that played a role in the partition of Africa in the early 19th century, right? Okay, so you see that also playing out here. And that is why China, if you look at their posture, they may not favor debt relief and probably will favor maturity reprofiling. And also, if you look at the way China had dealt with Africa, they don't do general lending. They are specific. And as Dr. My opponents here mentioned. Okay, so their lending is structured in such a way that unless the country is totally bankrupt, the issue of default doesn't arise. Okay, so for instance, so if you structure a transaction that is based on cocoa exports, you could not say that you are bankrupt as long as you are exporting cocoa and the revenue stream is guaranteed. Where is the default coming from? You understand that? So, and in a certain way, highlighting this collateralized debt and the rest of them, for me, is not extraordinary, right? Because in normal private sector lending, you go and borrow from a bank or something, there are collaterals. And all of that should make us responsible as a country.
But Prof, collateral in terms of even sales from electricity, isn't that, surprising?
I'm saying that a country with about 31 million people decided that this is how they want to structure this transaction. And the country was okay with it. Okay. You see, we need to situate this clearly and also balance the conversation. Because in as much as China's posture and their lending on the continent may have reservations, it's not so different from what we have witnessed from the West over the years, over the decades. You examine the literature and see how every one of them practically has used Africa as a stepping stone in terms of access to cheap raw materials. You can even talk about slave trade. You can talk about all of that. Look, in the run-up to the 2000 debt campaign, okay, we saw how from the 70s, the IMF World Bank reforms, structural adjustment reforms, economic recovery, and all of that, were largely predicated on export of primary commodities with unfavorable terms of trade. And Africa kept exporting primary commodities, very little value addition, right? Okay, and all of that created problems for us. And to date, almost 70% or more than 70% of Ghana's export earnings are still driven by primary commodities. Okay, the world thrives on margins.
Which we've almost collateralized all of them.
Of course. Okay, so the idea is that we just can't go into a contract, sign a contract, spend anyhow, and suddenly begin to cry that the world should sympathize with that suddenly. I feel a bit uncomfortable with that. As a sovereign nation, we have to be responsible. And I think that we need to situate this conversation within our medium to long-term foreign policy of how we relate with the West and their institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and China and Russia. Okay, for me is very, very important.
So on the back of foreign, policy, I would want to bring in Dr. Hlovo. I'm sure he's seen the IMF program, the extensive and very detailed document, and he's seen what we've said about China in terms of the collateralized loan, to the extent that, all the 619 million that we owe as collateralized loan is owed to China. Does he see, Doc, do you see any, these IMF program, our 17th IMF program, having any negative impact on our relationship with countries like China?
No, far from it. The point is that we have always gone to the IMF and have always implemented some of these conditions, and then we get the economy back to a certain level, and then we continue the borrowing. Now, the only point where you may have a problem with the Chinese is where it comes to a point where you are unable to fulfill the agreement you entered. As Prof. rightly said, you entered an agreement with them that you are using this as a collateral. But if you look at the agreement that we entered, actually, it wouldn't have been a problem if we have kept to what we said we will do. Because we said we will build the gas infrastructure and take proceeds from that to pay. So if you manage those infrastructures very prudently, it should not be difficult to pay. So some of the things that should be done, I don't think that it will lead to any major challenge in terms of foreign policy with the Chinese. Indeed, it should rather, I think that we should look at the Chinese as maybe an alternative to the Western agenda we have prosecuted all these years. But as I said, because we have dollarized the economy so much, so the dollar-CD ratio is always putting the pressure. Meanwhile, there is a lot of trade between Ghana and China. So if we can make the RMB known to people that, yes, the RMB is also an international currency, then you may have a little bit of the RMB becoming more usable here in Ghana. And therefore, as I said, Kenya, for instance, have some benefit of, using a lot of RMB. So they could do a currency swap with the Chinese and keep the economy running to a point. So in terms of foreign policy, Ghana is at a critical state in the sense that, given the global geopolitical nature of these debt issues, you are being pushed to either choose West or East. But you must find a way to stay in the middle. Because
Doc, sorry to interject. How do we do this when there's a condition in the IMF program that prevents us from running a multiple exchange rate system? More or less, we are probably leaning towards only the dollar. You spoke about dollarization of our economy. How do we go around such conditions?
Okay, so you may not be able to do it under the IMF program, okay? What you may do is that, of course, you are not going to stay under the IMF for forever. Just as we did the last one, we will come out of it. When you come out, what policies do you pursue to ensure that you don't go back? Those are very critical questions, because what we are doing now has been cyclical in the sense that we run the economy, we run into a ditch, we go to the IMF, we recover, and we continue the borrowing and this kind of thing. The fundamental question is that the Ghanaian state must be re-engineered to generate growth. Absorbing this neoliberal concoction without missing it, if anything, will not help you, because you are being told that the state is inefficient, therefore get rid of the state. But the same people giving you this concussion do not get rid of the state entirely in every aspect of the economy. The Chinese that have lent you that have given you the money have used the state as a developmental tool to promote development. So perhaps we have to have a broader conversation about the nature of the state and the role of the state in development, just assuming that the state have been inefficient, therefore should withdraw from every aspect of national life, of the economy, has not been productive. If you look at it carefully, sometimes we are not even sure what we are doing. At some point, we said that Ghana Telecom was not doing well because it's a state-owned enterprise. We sold it off. Then there is Tigo, which is not doing well. Then we bought it. So we need to look at these policies that we always borrow, which doesn't take into account even the socio-cultural milieu within which they will be implemented. So, for instance, we are supposed to increase taxation. Now, so as we increase taxation, in our particular circumstance, one worker takes care of so many people. So by taking money from him, we are impoverishing so many of them. If you don't have policies that take care of the very socioeconomic environment that they are being implemented, borrowing it from them, do it like this, we will go around the circle and come back. So the state must have a decisive role in the development process. There are critical areas that the state will drive all of us to. We can learn from others, but the most important thing is to come out with the Ghanaian crafted policy direction that coming out of this IMF, this is what we'll do. This is how we will maintain government. This amount that government is going to spend on government machinery, it will not go beyond this limit. This is how we're going to tackle the ever presence of corruption in our political setting. So if you do this and you have a clear path of how you want to run your economy, you may be more successful than just borrowing from these external ideas, which you implement, and most often than not, they generate growth in the short term, but in the long term, you run back to the same circle. So for me, we need a bigger conversation about the role of the Ghanaian state in the development.
Right.
How do we get ourselves out of this?
Right. Let me bring in Professor Bokpin. Prof, let me share this interesting data with you. So you were right when you said that we owe China about 1.9 billion US dollars. But I'm looking at my data repository here, and then I'm finding out that we have actually taken more than 4.7 billion US dollars from China between 2000 and 2019. Now, let me take you through this. So, former President Kofi, from 2008 to 2008, took a total sum of 735 million US dollars from China as project loans. JA Mills from 2009 to 2012 took 1 billion US dollars from China. Former President Mahama, 2013 to 2016, 1.5 billion US dollars. And then President Akufo-Addo from 2018 to 2019, just in a span of a year, has taken 1.46 billion US dollars. Do you really see any difference between this data that I've shared with you in terms of the allocations, the distribution, that within a very short period of time, from 2018 to 2019, we took a loan amount of 1.4 billion US dollars from China, and most of these loans were collateralized?
Yes. I think that you are looking at the balance at a certain point in time. Okay. Just quickly, a small intervention here. You know, my reading of the IMF program about the multiple exchange rates is not to say we cannot have other currencies trading on the market. It's more of within the same exchange rates or the currency, Bank of Ghana had its own low official rate. Then let's say the CD to the dollar or the dollar to the CD, Bank of Ghana had one rate, usually kept very low. Then we had one rate at the interbank level. We had another rate at the retail level. And then the proper rate was in the black market. So
or still leaning towards the dollar, isn't it?
Yes. So the idea is that what we want to do is to eliminate this multiplicity of exchange rates in the markets. Okay. And it's simply because Bank of Ghana wasn't aligning its rate with the market rate. Okay. So once you keep your rate low, and because of the tight window that they were operating with the banks, they give them the dollars. and then they give them a tight window within which they should operate. Okay, so when it happens that way, that rate that Bank of Ghana has will not be the transaction rates because you don't have dollar to sell at that particular rate. And that itself was feeding into the black market, right? And then so you could see people actually withdrawing their dollars from the formal financial system and heading straight to the black market because that is where the transaction rate is. Okay, so back to business on this. If you look at the way China's lending activities have been done, you will see clearly that we have underlying assets more or less to justify it. And for me, that is a big difference also from the general loans that we have done, and it's been difficult to identify what we have done with those loans. Hello, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so they are collateralized. You see the infrastructure. If it's about electricity, if it's about roads and all of that, or ports or the rest of them, you will see it. Okay. Unlike other general loans that we have taken, and we are struggling to identify what really we did with those loans. In any case, it's more about the balance. Given that we are not generating sufficient domestic revenue, and that itself is not the entire problem. And I've said this before, that if you look at the tax to GDP ratio of Malaysia, and you look at the tax to GDP ratio of Singapore, really, it has been almost below 15%. At some point in time, Ghana's tax to GDP ratio was higher than maybe Malaysia, Singapore. So you can see that Malaysia, Singapore, they have developed from lean government and efficiency and higher value for money. Okay, so in as much as we are encouraging government, and that is where I have a bit of a problem with the IMF program, that once your diagnosis of the problem is that we don't have a lot of revenue, that is why we run into these challenges, then the solution would also be heavily revenue-based. And that is what you see in the program. Meanwhile, it has to do with more of wastefulness, wasteful spending, inefficiency, corruption, and all of that. So we need to strike a good balance going forward. But let me say that in the last 25 years, whilst our traditional development partners, largely the West, were organizing sending off parties for themselves, at a time when Africa needs huge infrastructure financing, they were organizing sending off parties for themselves, and China stepped in strongly. You may not see the footprint of China in terms of our development space in Ghana as much as you see it in other countries in terms of critical infrastructure. Ports, of course, ports also so that they facilitate trade, right? As I said, China's policy, foreign policy in the last 3 decades has largely been predicated on debt and trade diplomacy, right? And all of that. And they've been able to weave their way through the African continent, and they have a strong presence on the continent. And now, if you see the way the geopolitics and geoeconomic fragmentation is actually playing out, that is why the China discussion is a big issue now. Now, it's not only in Ghana. If you look at the global data, okay, in terms of foreign direct investment flows, you see that since Russia-Ukraine, FDI flows have shifted in terms of the origin and then the destination. So you see the FDI flows now going to countries that are more aligned to, let's say, the West. Okay, and you see, so that is what is going to play out, that countries that are a bit more aligned on this block are likely to receive FDI flows from those leading countries, and then those that are also aligned here and all of that. But I think what is important for Africa is to be able to have a clear strategy an integrated one of how it intends to engage the emerging blocs.
Right.
Through the global geopolitics or economic fragmentation, you will see it happening. Now, we've seen that even FDI flows to China from the West has dipped.
So
you also...
Yeah, so I would like to bring in Dr. Hlovo. So far as this whole, geopolitics is concerned, do you think that Ghana is really taking advantage of what is currently happening? Do we actually indeed have a game plan?
That's a very important question, as to whether we have a game plan. But of course, even look at the speed of time within which we are able to push this IMF approval. I think that the situation may have played a role in the sense that it may have put the Chinese to come on board to not appear to the African partners as the bad guy who is blocking efforts at getting debt relief for them. But as to whether we have a strategy, currently that strategy is not clear to me. Because to have a strategy means that you first define your development priorities very right, and then you look around and look at the various actors within the international setting that are very important to your going forward, and then you devise a strategy to stay on their side. Now, for the last 2-3 years, we seem to align more to the West in our endeavors, although, yes, we still maintain a very good rapport with the Eastern Bloc. But we increasingly are looking like a country that is more aligning to the West. Yeah, it may be a strategy that may pay off because the West now need partners in Africa. After many years of absence, they need to re-engage. And so they may, I look at it like, even with the way the IMF became our spokesperson, is an indication that Ghana, which have been seen as the poster boy of the IMF success in Africa for so many years, if we should go down, then the Western poster boy is down, and therefore they need to prompt us up to at least that image of a West that is favorable to us. So perhaps, but we need to realign to try and stay in the middle, because we need the Chinese just as we need the Western partners. The Chinese come in with certain finances that help us to undertake large-scale infrastructure, which is critical. So if you look at some of the loans you mentioned, these are loans that are given for specific projects.
Absolutely.
And these projects, if you look at their economic value, they are actually very important to going forward. This kind of financing may not readily come from the West. So the best strategy I think we should adopt is to maintain the middle ground, where we welcome the Western partner, we welcome the Eastern partner.
Right.
Of course, the fragmentation, that's a very difficult strategy, but that is what government are elected to do.
Right.
So we must find the middle ground.
Right. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I think this is where time will allow us to peg our conversation. Unfortunately, I couldn't pick the last thought of Professor Godfred Bokwin, but I know he'll be speaking to us more on this issue tomorrow. But for the meantime, you can find more of this on this story on my Joy Online. Joy News Prime is up next. I'm Isaac Kofi Agyei.